Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is January 15, 2022. This is our third article about COVID of the weekend. There's really a lot happening. I mean, Omicron is overwhelming everything right now. And the capitalist leadership is saying, no, it's fine, it's mild. Well, no, it isn't. And actually, there are far reaching ramifications of this, and we're trying to cover various angles of that in these stories this weekend. So, anyway, our third article focuses on new faces of long COVID. We did one summary of long COVID in a video about 2 weeks ago. That was the pandemic may just be beginning video. If you want to see the long COVID section, there are timestamps. It's the last section before the end. Anyway, that summary of long COVID, which basically, what is long COVID? So you have the acute phase of COVID, and that's what everybody's trying to focus on right now as far as the leadership, who's trying to sweep Omicron under the rug and make people go to work and school and all that kind of stuff, saying, oh, the acute phase is more mild, especially if you're vaccinated. Well, for some people it is, for some people it isn't, and the bottom line is that it doesn't really matter in a sense anyway, because Omicron's so infectious that it's hitting so many people that the net result is, even if a lower percentage of them have the more severe acute symptoms, it's more people experiencing those symptoms overall when you look at the raw numbers. So emergency departments and hospitals are still getting overwhelmed, and that was our last story. But after the severe and acute phase is over, you can have symptoms, and even if your severe and acute phase wasn't that intense, you can still get long COVID. In fact, I believe off the top of my head from the previous long COVID summary that we read, there was not really a correlation between the intensity of symptoms during the acute phase and the likelihood of getting long COVID symptoms later, which really the symptoms are far ranging. They're cardiovascular issues, kidney issues, heart, lung, liver, brain damage, nervous system damage, all kinds of things. Fatigue is another super common one. Fatigue coupled with the brain fog, which is the virus got into your brain and it's causing problems in your brain, kind of like brain damage, that sort of brain fog. Anyway, those are major problems. What we're going to look at in this video are two more specific things. One is the likelihood of children who have been infected with COVID, and doesn't really matter whether it was severe or not, to get diabetes later. That's kind of a huge problem. And then also the effects of COVID on the immune system, specifically your T cells. It seems to kind of wipe out your immune system for the better part of a year. So we're going to go through that in detail. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe. Consider supporting at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So we're going to do kind of a deeper dive on the immune system front. I want to do more of a quick summary. This is a summary from Forbes. The headline is Children with COVID Face Increased Risk of Diabetes, CDC Finds. This article is from Mason Bisada, and it's dated January 7, 2022. So keep this in mind. The CDC knows this. It was their study. So the top line says, children who contract COVID-19 are significantly more likely to later be diagnosed with type 1 or 2 diabetes than children without COVID. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which no longer deserves that name, I will comment, found in a study Friday. Another potential complication from the coronavirus as child COVID-19 hospitalizations increase in the United States. Before we proceed with the article, I would also like to comment. It says children who contract COVID-19 are significantly more likely to later be diagnosed with type 1 or 2 diabetes. So why is that key to the point where I'm highlighting it instead of moving on with the article? Well, these are really different. I mean, they're both basically the same problem, but the causes are different. Type 1 diabetes is more the type that you're, quote, born with, and there's really nothing you can do about later. You just have to medicate and manage it. Type 2 diabetes is the type you're not born with. It's more acquired through bad diet and other things like that. Ultimately, it's the same type of problem with blood sugar dysregulation. But the two are really separate phenomena. The fact that COVID is increasing the likelihood of being diagnosed with both later, that's really something, because whatever COVID is doing, and we know it does many things in the body, it seems to be attacking the endocrine system, specifically the part that regulates your blood sugar metabolism, in some key ways. Now, is it possible that it's not causing the type 1 diabetes, but it's just, whatever the sort of underlying thing is, we're more likely to have caught COVID? Probably not. But let's go on with the summary. So we see key facts. The study drew millions of healthcare records from medical data analytics companies IQVIA and HealthVerity between March 2020 and June 2021. IQVIA's sample included almost 1.7 million children, and HealthVerity studied almost 900,000 children. So you got over 2.5 million children, their health records included in that. That's a very, very large sample. According to IQVIA's data, COVID-infected children were 2.66 times, or 166%, more likely to be diagnosed with diabetes over 30 days after infection than those who hadn't caught the coronavirus. And they were 2.16 times more likely to be diagnosed than those who dealt with a non-COVID respiratory infection prior to the pandemic. HealthVerity's data said that children who caught COVID-19 were 1.31 times, or 31%, more likely to be diagnosed with diabetes. The study said that the links between COVID-19 and diabetes are, quote, likely complex, but the two diseases may be connected because the coronavirus attacks cells in the pancreas, which produces insulin in the body. The study also noted COVID-19 has disproportionately affected racial and ethnic minority groups, and children in those groups also face an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. Race and ethnicity data were unavailable in the datasets. The CDC said that the findings highlight the importance of COVID-19 vaccinations among those eligible, currently ages 5 and up. Tangent. In Friday's study, the CDC noted a reported increase in type 1 diabetes diagnoses in European children during the pandemic, and previous research has found a possible link between COVID-19 and diabetes among adult patients. Plus, a November study of more than 3,800 COVID-19 patients found that just under half developed high blood sugar levels, which are linked to diabetes, after contracting the disease. What to watch for? Dr. Sharon Seda, lead author of the CDC study, told the New York Times Friday that it's unclear whether type 2 diabetes following COVID-19 will become a chronic condition in children or if it will fade over time. Comment, presumably, as the body heals whatever damage has been done to the pancreas by COVID, or whether that damage is more permanent. Key background. CDC Director Rochelle Walensky, who told reporters Friday that pediatric hospitalizations as a result of COVID-19 reached record numbers this week as the coronavirus's Omicron variant continues to spread, with a large portion of the increase coming from children ages 4 and under who are not yet eligible to receive the COVID-19 vaccines. While COVID-related hospitalization rates are still low for this age group compared to adults, Walensky stressed, quote, "It's critically important that we surround them with people who are vaccinated to provide them protection." Comment, that will do fucking nothing, and she has to know that. Correction, it won't do nothing, but you're still subjecting them to a huge amount of risk. Why? Because the vaccines do not significantly reduce transmission. What they do is, after the first week or so, the viral load in a person who has that immunity from the vaccination, their body will attack the virus faster, and so your viral load will drop more quickly. However, people who are both vaccinated and unvaccinated have comparable viral load in that first 6 days or so. So just letting Omicron rip and then saying, oh, kids should just be around vaccinated people. Well, vaccinated people can still transmit, including to children, particularly in that first week when the body has not come to terms with the COVID yet. So Walensky saying that, as the CDC has been saying, it's hugely irresponsible. They're not even trying to control transmission. They're just saying, oh, well, vaccines. That's not really addressing the problem. That addresses symptoms after infection, doesn't really address getting it. Continuing. Experts say hospitalization rates may be up because Omicron is more transmissible than previous forms of the virus, and because the variant tends to attack the upper airway system rather than the lungs, with children more vulnerable to complications from upper respiratory conditions than adults. So here we go. Another face of long COVID is diabetes in definitely children, possibly adults also. But let's now turn to a full study, and this is on the effects of COVID on the immune system. So the title is Immunological Dysfunction Persists for 8 Months Following Initial Mild to Moderate SARS coronavirus 2 infection. So key there, following initial mild to moderate COVID-19 infection. So Omicron's mild, maybe in the acute first phase, but how about immunological dysfunction persisting for 8 months? So there are a lot of authors on this study. I'll just put those on the screen, and of course we'll link to this as well. This is in Nature Immunology. And before we get into the article, I'd like to note, anecdotally, I've heard from a lot of people who got COVID and then got some other weird infection that was not viral in nature, possibly related to what we're going to read about here. That is speculation on my part. In fact, again, anecdotally, in my own case, I believe that I have had COVID 3 times. I have not had a positive test for one reason or another. In one case, well, 2 cases I didn't get tested. And then I think that the third case I got tested, but it was, I think I wasn't, I think I waited too long to get the test. But the first and second times felt exactly the same. And anyway, massive fatigue in my case, like fatigue to the point where around 3:30 or 4 in the afternoon, I would have to lie down on the couch and I was just done for the day. And then after about 2 hours of lying on the couch, I would feel like I'd have a little energy again. And then I would get up and literally 5 minutes later, I'd be completely wiped out and I'd have to lie down again. This lasted for over a month. And it was in addition to feeling like both hot and cold at the same time, like, body was not handling temperature and being painful and achy and everything else. I fortunately didn't have a lot of other, the acute respiratory symptoms, but it was horrible and wiped me out for a very long time. And I was working on a number of other projects and I kind of abandoned a lot of them for months. Like it completely disrupted my life. That was last December. Then I got it or something again in like July, August, somewhere around that time. And I swear for 2 months I was completely out of it, like completely out of it. It was like I couldn't sleep, I had pain, I had fatigue, I had brain fog, just completely out of it. And then after all that, I got the worst sinus infection of my life. I needed 2 rounds of antibiotics in a row. I've never had anything like that. It was crazy. It was crazy. Like my sinuses were like turning inside out. It was ridiculous. So, COVID and the immune system. Fun stuff. Let's get into it. A proportion of patients surviving acute coronavirus disease 2019, COVID-19 infection, develop post-acute COVID syndrome, long COVID or LC, lasting longer than 12 weeks. Here, we studied individuals with long COVID compared to age and gender matched recovered individuals without long COVID, unexposed donors, and individuals infected with other coronaviruses. Patients with long COVID had highly activated innate immune cells, lacked naive T and B cells, and showed elevated expression of type 1 interferon, interferon beta, and type 3 interferon, interferon lambda 1, that remained persistently high at 8 months after infection. Pause. What are those things? So B and T cells are basically immune system cells, and interferons are a type of cytokine, which are immune system chemicals. To get a little more specific, basically in your bone marrow, there are stem cells. And these stem cells in your bone marrow produce cells which some of them stay in your bone marrow and they mature into the B cells. And then others are released into the blood, where they eventually go to your thymus gland, which is in your upper chest, between your lungs, above your heart, basically just below where your neck joins your chest. Your thymus is there, and basically some of these lymphocytes there get processed into T cells, which, yes, are named after the thymus. So after the B cells have matured in the bone marrow and after the T cells have matured in the thymus, they then circulate in the body, some of them staying in the blood and some of them going to the lymph system and the lymphatic organs like the lymph nodes or the spleen. And so once they're matured and they're hanging out in the body, they play key roles in defending your body against infection and also in maintaining health. So starting with the T cells, there are three types of T cells. There are helper T cells, there are killer T cells, and there are memory T cells. We'll come back to the helper ones last because they play a role in both T cell and B cell function. But basically the killer T cells, also known as cytotoxic meaning cell toxic. So these are cells that can break down cells. So why would you want to break down a cell in your body? Well, if it's a cancer cell, for example, or if it's a cell that's infected with a virus, then you would want to break that down. So the killer T cells, that's their job. And the helper T cells basically sprinkle some chemicals on the killer T cells to get them fully ready for that. And then the memory T cells are basically killer T cells that are reserved for next time, so that you have like an immediate frontline defense that's just ready to go. Okay, so that's the T cells. Now the B cells, basically these are cells that they have little receptors on their surface, and the receptors are designed to bind with different types of antigens. What's an antigen? Well, an antigen is kind of any chemical that can stimulate your immune system. Usually these are foreign substances, although there also can be like autoimmune responses where your immune system gets stimulated by things you're producing yourself, and that's usually not a good situation. But anyway, the B cells are there to detect the presence of stuff your body doesn't want, more or less. Then once a B cell has bound with this, it's got like little receptors all over it. Once something sticks to the B cell, and it does this in the presence of a helper T cell, the helper T cell, just like in the case of the killer T cell, helper T cell comes over and sprinkles chemicals on the B cell, and then the B cell starts to change, it starts to clone itself, and just like the T cell would go into killer mode and then also memory mode to reserve some for later, you get some B cells that are used immediately in the production of antibodies. Antibodies are what your body produces to attack whatever's doing the antigens and to kill that, basically trying to neutralize the source of whatever caused that antigen to be present in the first place. And so yeah, so basically you get B cells that turn into plasma cells, that's the antibody producing ones. And then just like with the killer cells, some are left over as memory cells to be used next time without having to go through this whole process of, the helper T cells activating and all that. They're just ready to go from the jump. Now, that's basically an overview of the B cells and the T cells, where the paper talks about naive B and T cells. These are the ones that have not been fully matured yet, haven't been activated into those forms that can do all those things. They're just closer to the precursor stage. So lacking in them, not a good thing, because that's like saying you have no trainees for your army, basically. So when your current army gets wiped out, you don't have any soldiers in reserve. Not a good thing. Now, what's interferon? I said it's a cytokine. Well, remember how I said that the helper T cells would come over and sprinkle chemicals on the B cells that have bound with an antigen, or with the killer T cells to activate both of them and make them do their thing? Well, the chemicals that they sprinkle are cytokines. Cytokines can also have other direct effects causing inflammation and things that can alert the body and other things in the body to do other responses. But basically, those are the chemicals, interferons being one type. So if you're seeing persistently elevated interferon levels for months afterwards, it kind of seems like your body is still desperately trying to fight this. Either that, or it's gone haywire and it's doing this for no reason. We'll probably find that out in this article. Either way, it's pathological and it's not a sign of a healthy immune system. Before we move on, though, I just want to mention monoclonal antibodies. You've probably heard this term because it's one of the leading therapies used for people who have the more severe acute respiratory distress that can be caused by COVID-19. They give them monoclonal antibodies. Well, what does that mean? Monoclonal means one clone, so it's just one type of antibody. But this is basically the B cells. Your B cells produce the antibodies. So basically, monoclonal antibody therapy, it's basically like they generate a bunch of antibodies through this process, rather than waiting for your body, which eventually will, your B cells will be stimulated and they will produce antibodies. But they're basically just infusing them into a person's system from an external source where they can then, go on to serve the same function. But of course, that requires a lab and very specific conditions to generate those monoclonal antibodies. So one more thing before we move on. On the subject of viruses, which can have immunological effects, have you heard of HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, which can cause something called AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome? Well, HIV attacks helper T cells, among other things, but one of its main targets is a type of helper T cell called CD4. If you recall from just a moment ago, what do helper T cells do? They stimulate B cells to get active, and they can also stimulate killer T cells to get active. So if you are suffering from a deficiency of helper T cells, your B and other T cells may not get stimulated to do their jobs. So in the case of this study on COVID-19, let's turn back to that and read that sentence again. Patients with long COVID had highly activated innate immune cells, lacked naive T and B cells, and showed elevated expression of type 1 interferon and type 3 interferon that remained persistently high at 8 months after infection. So yeah, lacking naive T and B cells, that is the basis of your future immune system foot soldiers. And then having elevated interferon, that is your helper T cells trying to activate things, and those can cause inflammation in your body. Continuing. Using a log linear classification model, we defined an optimal set of analytes that had the strongest association with long COVID among the 28 analytes measured. Combinations of the inflammatory mediators interferon beta, PTX3, that's pentraxin-related protein. It's an anti-inflammatory, often associated with lung inflammation. Interferon gamma, interferon lambda 2 and 3, and interleukin-6, associated with long COVID, with 78.5 to 81.6% accuracy. This work defines immunological parameters associated with long COVID and suggests future opportunities for prevention and treatment. Acute COVID-19, caused by infection with severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, or SARS coronavirus 2, is characterized by a broad spectrum of clinical severity, from asymptomatic to fatal. The immune response during acute illness contributes to both host defense and pathogenesis, or that's the emergence of disease, of severe COVID-19. Pronounced immune dysregulation. Dysregulation just means improper regulation, so basically, pronounced immune dysregulation means your immune system is really out of whack. With lymphopenia, penia is too little of something, so too little lymphocytes, and increased expression of inflammatory mediators. That was the increased amounts of the interferon and all that stuff, have been described in the acute phase. So that's when you get the severe initial first few weeks. But following acute COVID-19 infection, a proportion of patients develop physical and neuropsychiatric symptoms lasting longer than 12 weeks, known as long COVID, chronic COVID syndrome, or post-acute sequelae of COVID-19. Sequelae are just kind of like consequences, henceforth denoted as LC. I'll keep saying long COVID. Although similar syndromes have been described following infections with SARS coronavirus 1, remember that happened in the early to mid-2000s, like 03-04, and Middle East Respiratory Syndrome-related coronavirus, or MERS. Long COVID often develops after mild to moderate COVID-19. Let me read that again. Long COVID often develops after mild to moderate COVID-19. Omicron can be, quote, mild all you want, and it's debatable if Omicron's acute phase should be called mild, but even if the acute phase is mild, doesn't mean anything because, again, long COVID often develops after mild to moderate COVID-19. Symptoms persisting 6 months were observed in 76% of hospitalized patients, with muscle weakness and fatigue being most frequently reported. So, 6 months after you're hospitalized, you have a 3 out of 4 chance of having muscle weakness and fatigue. That's pretty significant, especially when you speak with some of the people who've had the fatigue. It's like debilitating to where they can't work. Continuing. Long COVID affects between 10 and 30% of community managed, meaning non-hospitalized, COVID-19 cases 2 to 3 months after infection. So, if you are not hospitalized, your odds are between 10 and 30% of having long COVID symptoms 2 to 3 months after infection. And, it continues, these can persist more than 8 months after infection. So I'd like to highlight here, commenting again, this article was last updated, basically they finished revising it, November 25th, around Thanksgiving. So whereas the long COVID study that we read previously had higher rates of long COVID, that was dealing with the unvaccinated time period. Most of the people that they were looking at were unvaccinated. They were mostly 2020 cases. Now, this study is from the end of 2021. So I would assume a high proportion of these also include vaccinated people. So those odds of getting COVID, they're lower overall than we saw in the previous, but not by a whole lot. Continuing. Long COVID symptoms include severe relapsing fatigue, dyspnea, that's difficulty breathing, chest tightness, cough, brain fog, and headache. The underlying pathophysiology of long COVID is poorly understood. Comment, we do have a chart in the previous video that I keep referring to that shows kind of like in a flowchart style the relationship between some of the different types of organ damage and medication interactions that can result in long COVID. But I would support this statement that it's poorly understood because there's probably a lot going on that we still don't know. Here, we analyzed a cohort of individuals, it's just a group of individuals, followed systematically for 8 months after COVID-19 infection, according to a predefined schedule, comparing them to healthy donors unexposed to COVID-19, which they refer to in the study as unexposed healthy controls, or UHCs, before December 2019, and individuals who had been infected with prevalent human coronaviruses, and then they name a bunch of them like human coronavirus, NL63, etc., but not SARS coronavirus 2. The ADAPT study enrolled adults with SARS coronavirus 2 infections confirmed by PCR at St. Vincent's Hospital, community-based testing clinics in Sydney, Australia. For the majority of participants, their first visit occurred between months 2 and 3 after infection, median of 79 days after the date of initial diagnosis, with 93.6% and 84.5% of participants completing subsequent month 4, median 128 days, and month 8, median 232 days visits. So, in other words, most of the people came back for follow-ups, 85% for the 8-month and 94% for the 4-month. Of the 147 patients recruited, 70.5% through ADAPT sites and 29.5% externally, 31 participants, 21%, were designated as long COVID based on the occurrence of one of 3 major symptoms, fatigue, difficulty breathing, or chest pain, at month 4. These participants were age and gender matched with 31 asymptomatic matched controls from the same cohort, who did not report symptoms at month 4 after infection, but were symptomatic during the acute phase of the infection. There was a 10% trend towards some improvement of symptoms over time in long COVID, but this trend was not statistically significant. So commenting, what does that mean? Statistical significance in a study like this means that it is very unlikely to have occurred by chance, meaning you can get results which indicate a trend, like in this case, it looked like there was a 10% trend toward improvement of symptoms over time, but it could have occurred by chance and they really can't rule that out. So continuing, to examine biomarkers, so that's just various biological measurements associated with long COVID, we assessed 28 analytes. Analytes are just things or chemical samples that you're analyzing in the serum of patients from the long COVID, matched cohort, human coronavirus, and unexposed healthy control groups at month 4 after infection using a bead-based assay. 6 pro-inflammatory cytokines, interferon beta, interferon lambda 1, interferon gamma, and etc. There are a few other ones there. And soluble T-cell immunoglobulin mucin domain 3 were elevated in the long COVID and matched cohort groups compared to the non-SARS coronavirus and completely unexposed healthy control groups, with no difference observed in the other 22 analytes, including interleukin 6 and 33. There was no difference between long COVID and matched cohorts for any individual analyte at this time point. And just looking ahead here, it gets into like really weedy technical details. This is a little bit different. This is a lot more specific than the summary that I read last time. So I set out intending to read this whole thing, and I think I'm going to skip to the summary. So skipping ahead, in summary, our data indicate an ongoing, sustained inflammatory response following even mild to moderate acute COVID-19, which is not found following prevalent coronavirus infection. Commenting, to restate that, COVID is doing things that other human coronaviruses do not do. The other human coronaviruses do not do the ongoing sustained inflammatory response. Continuing. The drivers of this activation, the inflammatory response, require further investigation, but possibilities include persistence of antigen. So what does that mean? Remember, antigens are substances which are triggering to your immune system, and they can include, for example, proteins on the outside of a virus. So antigen persistence in the context of COVID could mean that the virus is persisting, or that some part of the virus somehow, like not the whole active virus, but some part of the virus is persisting in the body. Autoimmunity driven by antigenic cross-reactivity. What does that mean? It means that you have developed an autoimmune condition where your immune system is reacting to your own human bodily tissue because it is getting confused and it is seeing your bodily tissue as this, pathogenic threat. So from this, can we say that it is possible, according to this study, that COVID may increase the risk of developing autoimmune diseases? Possible, needs further study. In fact, I was just looking at another study from August 2020 about that exact same topic. Maybe we'll cover it on here. Or a reflection of damage repair, meaning that COVID has caused a lot of extensive damage in the body, which it takes months and months to repair, and it's causing this ongoing sustained inflammation. So just to recap that, because I injected a lot of comments, the drivers of this activation require further investigation, but possibilities include persistence of antigen, autoimmunity driven by antigenic cross-reactivity, or a reflection of damage repair. These observations describe an abnormal immune profile in patients with COVID-19 at extended time points after infection, and provide clear support for the existence of a syndrome of long COVID. Our observations provide an important foundation for understanding the pathophysiology of this syndrome and potential therapeutic avenues for intervention. So that's the end of the article. However, I wanted to go back because that subject of the naive B and T cells missing, I wanted to say something about that. So again, this article is like super technical, but I think I found a passage that is usable for our purposes. So an unbiased, large-scale dimensional reduction approach that's just the method that they used, identified the depletion of 3 clusters of naive B and T cell subsets present in the long COVID group at month 8 after infection. Altogether, these observations suggest the persistent conversion of naive T cells into activated states. Skipping ahead, the ultimate result of this chronic stimulation may be the expansion of certain types of memory T cells. So commenting again, that's the last excerpt from the article that I'm going to read. It seems like, we were talking before about the naive T and B cells being missing. It seems like where they're going is they're getting activated. They're no longer naive because they keep getting used up and turned into particular types of memory cells by all of these cytokines that are found in elevated concentrations in people who have long COVID. So if I'm reading this correctly, essentially the naive cells are just getting sucked into duty immediately and used up in this process. So once they're converted into that, they're not necessarily available to do other things that your immune system may need. So I'll refrain from further commentary or speculation on this subject, but suffice to say, it does seem that these findings suggest pronounced immunological effects of COVID-19 for 8 months, maybe longer, after infection. So in this video, we have talked about 3 potential new phases of long COVID: diabetes in both adults and in children, although the risk seems to be heightened in children over adults, but that's kind of a huge concern, particularly in the United States, where there's already, there's so much added sugar in everything. Anyway, type 2 diabetes is already a real concern, and metabolic syndrome, which can precede it. It's kind of pre-diabetes, it's sometimes called. So you got that. You have this study talking about chronic inflammation and lack of naive T and B cells. Also mentioned kind of more in passing, but the potential development of autoimmune disorders from COVID as part of the long COVID experience. This is not a cold, this is not a flu, and as this study that I was reading from shows, they compared the results in the COVID group to people who were infected with other kinds of coronaviruses, and there were significant differences. So there are studies being churned out right now on COVID-19 because it is novel and people are trying to learn in a desperate hurry what this thing is capable of. I happen to grab these couple of random studies as we've talked about long COVID in the past. Take this thing seriously, avoid exposure, do not get it to get it. You don't know what you're going to be doing to your body. Obviously the herd immunity policy, this is maybe avoiding, death at the acute stage, but you don't know what you're doing to yourself in the long term. And death is also bad, but disabling like significant chunks of the country or the world, let's just disable 30% of the population. That's going to have ramifications. So it's up to people to fight back against the kind of, laissez-faire policies that we're seeing. And I'm exhausted, so I'm going to just wrap it up here, but hopefully you get the idea. What do you think? Leave a comment or question below, and we'll continue the discussion there. Again, none of this is medical advice, obviously. We're just reading a few studies. Anyway, take care. Thanks for watching, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful, so thank you very much for those. I really appreciate it. If you'd like to help out without making a donation, click like, subscribe, leave a comment, even if it's just good video, or comment for the algorithm or whatever. All that helps to boost the channel, as does sharing it on your social media. We need to expand the audience and expand this conversation, so all of that helps with that, and I appreciate your support in that regard. Back in the real world, join an organization, or at least make a donation to one if you're not ready to join. Look for something that is active in your area, ideally, and doing the kind of work that you would support or want to get involved with. Also, a good sign is if you contact the organization and they get back to you promptly. It's better to get involved with an organization that has their act together and is not dysfunctional. That can actually be a really huge drain on your life if you get involved with the wrong org. Or start your own project. If you have the idea, the experience, the comrades, and the resources, we love seeing good news of new projects getting launched. So that's a good idea as well. Otherwise, thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next video.